that, I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm Christina Andreessen. I'm the manager for chapter relations for Orthodox Christian Fellowship. And here with me tonight is Father Miles, who serves as currently as the Carpatho-Russian representative on our board of directors, as well as our national chaplain. And then finally, we have our panelists this evening, Father Kosmas and Anna Kallis in Illinois. Father Kosmas is the assistant pastor at St. Peter and Paul Orthodox Church in Glenville, is that right? Illinois? I always forget if it's Glenville or Glenview. Glenview, Illinois. See, I got it wrong. Where prior to that, he served as the youth director. And he's very involved has been and is very involved in the Metropolis of Chicago Youth and Young Adult Ministries, serving as the spiritual advisor for many of them. And his wife, Anna, is the director of youth programs for Faith Tree Resources, as well as the director of the Crossroad session that just started this summer in Crossroads. So she has extensive experience as well in youth and young adult ministry, as well as in resource and curriculum development. So we thank them very much for being with us tonight and sharing their expertise. And we'll let you take it from there.
Thanks for having us.
We're excited to be here. So as we kick this off, as you know, the topic is we're going to be kind of walking you through how to facilitate great discussions, particularly with the college age students in OCF ministry. And before we jump into the how, I just want to take a minute and explain why do we even care about what's the purpose of discussions? Why are we going to go spend an hour right now to articulate how to facilitate great discussions? So kind of thinking about what is the purpose of facilitating great discussions. I think it's safe to presume that if you are on this call, you are interested in leading college age students, so you're interested in facilitating the faith formation, particularly of college age students. And we really find that discussion is a critical mechanism for faith formation, particularly in college age students. It is the core of how my husband and I teach all young people, and especially college age youth. Our college students have a lot of thoughts going through their mind. They have a lot of opinions, a lot of feelings, a lot is pent up within them. And in order for real transformation to happen and real faith formation to occur, those thoughts and those feelings need to be articulated. And when they're articulated, they really take on a new life. So an internal thought is wonderful, and it's even wonderful for that internal thought to be processed via journaling or pondered over, but it's even more effective when those internal thoughts and feelings are expressed in an environment where others can help mold and shape and share. And then as a group, we are molding and shaping and sharing each other's thoughts and feelings and opinions. And then through that kind of an experience, really true transformation happens and true formation occurs. And so we really care about healthy discussion, and we've taken a lot of time in thinking through how to effectively facilitate that and to allow that to come alive for young people, and especially our college age kids.
All right. I guess the first step for us to think about, sorry about my voice. We had a retreat this weekend and it got a little exciting. Sorry about that. So forgive me. I would say we first have to think about what our role is if we're a facilitator, right? If it's our job to kind of lead these discussions, what is our job and how is that supposed to look like, when we're dealing with young people? I mean, it's really a huge responsibility and a blessing to do so. And so it's important to think about what's my role in an intentional way, as an OCF leader or conversation facilitator. And I think the first thing to remember is that, especially with OCF, we kind of have a sustained role, right? We're not just coming in like Anna and I and just talking to a group of people we can't even see one time, right? But we're first and foremost building relationships with these young people, right? So we have to think of it that way, that this is a sustainable role, that the way you might approach anything you're doing with the college kids, whether you're having a discussion or going out to dinner for pizza, it's about you building a relationship with them, because whether you're ordained or not, you are a representative of the church for that audience, right? This is, for a lot of college kids, their only connection point with the church. for better, for worse, that's just a fact. It's probably their only connection point. And so to remember that. And so how crucial it is to do the simple things like know their names and make it clear to them that you know their names, right? To make it clear to them that you know what's going on in their life. And so you're following up with them, asking them questions in that few minutes before you have a discussion about what's going on in their life, how that midterm went, or how they're feeling about these finals coming up. So you're saying to them, through what you're saying to them, I know you, I care about you, and I care about our relationship. That's got to be the basis for how you're dealing with anybody, of course, as a Christian, and most especially as a facilitator for an OCF discussion, right? And the more and more you do that, the more and more deep these conversations will go when you're leading them, and the more comfortable they will be when you're leading them. It's kind of that old adage, show me that you know me before you show me what you know, right? And I think that's really, really important. Now, when we're getting into the actual conversation, it's easy to think, oh, I'm just going to throw out this idea and it'll just happen and it'll take shape. Sometimes that works. And for some people who are really charismatic, that works. But, there's another old adage that I like, which is that if you don't like the recipe, if you don't like what the recipe is, you have to change it, right? And so we have to think about our conversations as a recipe. Whether or not we're intentional about it, there is a recipe as to how that conversation is played out in an OCF setting. And so we have to think about what that recipe is. So we have to be intentional. A really good analogy as someone who is facilitating a conversation, especially an OCF conversation, is to think of yourself as an orchestra conductor, right? You're not playing the music. You're not tuning the instruments, right? But you are conducting and guiding and leading, but you're really not even saying or making any sound yourself, right? And that's a really good analogy for how we should try to approach facilitating conversations, especially with college students. We want to make sure it doesn't sound awful, right, as an orchestra conductor, but at the same time, we're not doing everything. We're not playing the instruments. Okay, so I'd like to just point out at five major points that we'll kind of unpack together about what the facilitator is and is not responsible for, to help us kind of take our next step in this conversation. Some things the facilitator is responsible for. We have to create the space. And when we say create the space, we'll unpack that more. That means the physical space and the emotional and non-physical space of a conversation. That's super, super important. As a facilitator, it's our job to identify and select the right topics, right? And we'll talk about that. We have to make sure that we are asking effective questions. Not asking questions, but asking effective questions, right? We need to moderate the discussion as well, right? We got to keep the ball in play. And we also have to manage conflict, especially with the college student setting. Just as soon as we start talking politics or something, it's going to get a little bit conflicting. And we have to, in a Christian way, facilitate that. That's our job. And then what we're not responsible for, going back to that analogy of the conductor, we are not responsible for playing the music. We are conducting the orchestra, right? We're keeping the ball in play. We're not playing the game, right? And so it's really important for us to not overteach, overtalk, or just really be, or even to pontificate as a facilitator, especially in a discussion setting. There's a time and place for a presentation. That's not what we're typically trying to accomplish when we're with an OCF group at a college campus with some pizza, trying to just dive deeper into specific discussion topics.
Great. So we're gonna go unpack these 5 different elements or different roles that the facilitator has. And after each one, we will open it up for questions. If you have any questions, it's a little content heavy, and so we'll take a break after each kind of role.
It's important to say that it's so hard to try to have like a discussion like we like to have a discussion online, because typically we would
typically when we give a talk like this, we would actually model the discussion, but it's a little bit difficult.
It's hard
to do that
online. So we'll pause a few times.
Yeah. So this is not a model for how to facilitate the discussion. Okay, so the first role of the facilitator is to create the space. And as my husband mentioned, there's creating the physical and the non-physical space. So a few notes on creating the physical space. Physical space is important. And when you're thinking about where you're going to go to take these where you're going to be leading this discussion, it's important to to have some intentionality behind that. If this is an intense topic that you are going to be covering, you probably want to be in a quiet and private space where, you're not necessarily at a restaurant where there's loud music and people around you that can hear if it's a serious type of conversation. There may be settings for kind of a coffee shop type conversation, especially if there's like a coffee shop with a wide open space where you could all kind of gather, have a cup of coffee. That can create a relaxed and tone and a relaxed, great setting for some kinds of great conversation. So think through the type of conversation you're going to have and the space that you want to have it in. It may sound a little bit silly to think that closely about those details, but it really, we do have to think about where you're having the conversation and the kind of space, because ambiance facilitates conversation. The right kind of ambiance facilitates certain kinds of conversation. So just think that through. But I care a little bit more about the non-physical space. So I would say, a healthy space is critical for fruitful discussion. So what are the elements of a healthy and a safe space? The first one I would identify is a space of non-judgment. So this is where your job is crucial as a facilitator to model this for the rest of the group, that we really want a space where everyone's opinion is valid. Every question that is asked is received and not criticized. And particularly when people are coming forth with opinions that you yourself don't agree with, or that we may think contradict what our faith teaches, it's really, really important that those opinions, those questions and statements are not judged, but are affirmed, are welcomed. We'll get to the respect piece in a minute. So of course, everything must be, there must be a ground rule that everything must be stated with respect, but you have to welcome everyone's thoughts and feelings without judgment, because they're not, even if you think they're wrong, they're not wrong, they're real. These college kids have what they're thinking and feeling is very real to them, and they need a space to articulate that and then to further unpack that. And so it's important for you to model that and not shutting down what you may think is a silly thought, or what others might think are a silly or an incorrect thought. Really creating that tone of non-judgment is really, really important for a fruitful conversation. And then respect. So this is, of course, related to non-judgment, but it goes a little bit deeper. As a facilitator, you need to nurture a respect for each person in the room and each person's thoughts and feelings. So not only are you giving them the space and allowing them to share, but you're actually respecting what they're sharing. So you're interested in it. You're affirming it. You're saying you're interested in knowing where their thoughts are coming from and wanting to know more about them. And so it's important to welcome and to model that for everyone, because you may get to a point where there may be some conflict in the room, where someone is really not agreeing with the other person's thought, and it's going to be your job to really model that respect that you're going to have for everyone's opinions, and to just that we may not all agree, but we do deeply respect. Then the course, confidentiality. Participants, you want your college kids to know that what is said in the room is going to stay in the room. If you want really fruitful discussion, college young people have to have the freedom to know that what they say is going to stay there. And so setting up ground rules around confidentiality, that what we say and what we talk about in our OCF group stays there, and it's not going to leave the room and be talked about and gossiped about later on. Also, another element to a safe space is a relaxed and a stress-free zone. I think this one, just kind of maintaining a little bit of lightheartedness and peacefulness throughout the discussion, it can be really effective. You may be covering a lot of intense topics, and especially college-age kids have a lot of heavy thoughts, and it would not be appropriate to just totally humorize serious thoughts, but there is a place for, just as the facilitator, as the moderator, to create a little lightheartedness and to create when necessary, insert a little bit of humor, insert a little bit of some statements that keep the tone relaxed. This is not like, we don't need to walk in with an agenda and all these things that we need to go through. These kids have been studying all week in college. They have a lot on their plate. This space should be a little bit more relaxed, a little bit more stress-free. And then finally, the final element for a safe space, I would say, is technology boundaries. I think you'll probably struggle with this more in high school students versus college students, but I would say that we're seeing now college students struggle with this more. Just create some ground rules around technology. It's very tempting to have, our phones are with us at all times. It's very tempting to just, kids are on them and responding to texts, to have them kind of come up with some boundaries, because no one feels, there's nothing that makes you feel like you're not being listened to more than someone being on their phone while you're saying something. So that can really shut down conversation if other people are on their phone, because it makes the person who's speaking feel like they're not being listened to, their opinions aren't being cared about. And so creating some boundaries around that, I think, can really be effective for facilitating a safe space.
And we have to do that ourselves too. And I'm saying that because I'm guilty of this too. If we're a ordained or not ordained ministry leader, our phone's probably buzzing like crazy, including during these conversations, and including during that 5 minutes before we get started and 5 minutes after we're done. Super important to be really, really, really present during this 1 hour or whatever it might be that these college kids are giving of their time to you. So
it matters. It makes a big deal. Yeah. So then put that limit on yourself also. You need, as a facilitator, need to be, when you're in the room with the kids, you're not on your phone. You're present with them. And so how do you facilitate this kind of a safe space? How do you accomplish all these things? I keep saying, you have to model a lot of these things. The students are going to follow your lead. So if you're modeling non-judgment and respect and not gossiping outside of the room, that the students are going to follow that. So a huge thing would be modeling. If you're setting these ground rules and not modeling it, they're very quickly going to not model it as well, or not follow it as well. And then have them make ground rules as a group. So I do this for all ages that I work with, junior high, high school, and college students. Give them the power to make the ground rules for the group. Put it on them, because then they'll be more likely to follow those rules, and they're going to articulate 99% of the things I just said. And so give them ownership over those ground rules, and then make sure that you're reminding them of those ground rules and those expectations and holding them to it. So in my high school Sunday school class, we actually have a sheet of paper on the wall with the ground rules the kids make up. I'm not sure if that's so feasible for college kids, but do a formal process of coming up with ground rules for these discussions. It's helpful.
Should we ask if there's questions?
Yeah, so we can pause. Does anyone have any questions on creating the safe space, or effective or safe space?
And also, if you have any experiences from your own chapters where you can affirm what Father Kosmas and Anna have shared, we'd love to hear that as well. Keep going. No, if you think of anything, please don't feel free to type it out. Oh, nope, someone raised their hand. Here we go. Father David Smith, we will let you come and ask your question or share with us. Here, there he is. Hi, Father David.
Hi. And you can hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Father Kosmas mentioned asking a question that, what I heard was asking a question that generates discussion. And Father Kosmas, I'm wondering if you could just give an example of a question that does versus a question that doesn't.
Yeah, one of our buckets that we're gonna talk about is the art of asking an effective question. But just to answer your question, since you asked, if we ask a question that is likely gonna have a yes or no answer, that would be a non-leading question, right? Because, for example, the church teaches X, Y, or Z. Do you agree? The person's gonna say yes or no, and it could be more of a pit hole, where as opposed, the same topic you could ask, as opposed to do you agree, you could say, what do you think about this position of the church? All of a sudden now you've prompted the participant to generate thought and share that thought. Now, what's cool about that is not only does it for that one participant, but it's going to do it for the whole group. It'll become contagious because everyone else is going to think, well, I want to say my opinion about that too. And so all of a sudden you've gotten a group of people thinking and generating a dialogue, and you're just sitting there watching you can just sit and watch it. You're directing the orchestra. Just like, oh, okay. Yep. And you. But we'll talk more about effective questions in a minute as well too. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yes, it does.
Anyone else, Christina?
No, I think let's go ahead because I think your next section is on questions. So I think Father David moves us right into that, didn't he?
Yeah.
You're going to do the topics first. That's right, topics first.
Yeah. So this is just a small thing, but it's super important, which would be identifying and selecting the right topics at the right time. Okay. So of course, especially when I first left the summer, it was like the first time I went to an OCF meeting, I had all these ideas of, what I was going to teach them. You know what I mean? I was, Mr. Young, cool priest, whatever. And that didn't work. And what I realized, and I'm still realizing, I'm not an expert or something. I'm learning as I go. But one thing I've learned a lot about is that the right topic is the topic that the college students want to talk about. That's the right topic. Partnered with the topic that you as a facilitator are able to and ready to talk about. Those two things married together make a great conversation. So sometimes in OCF, people have brought up topics to me and said, can we talk about this? And I'm ready to talk about it. We just talked about it. It was great. Other times I parked it. I said, you know what? That's a great topic. I want to take some time and do some research and read a little bit about it and figure that out, right? And so I think it's important to think about first of all, think about as a facilitator, these are some topics, or maybe a better way to say it would be, these are some goals I have for our OCF this year. It would be great if we at some point talked more about fasting. We talked more about the rules of the church and how they're not constricting, but actually freeing, even though oftentimes, especially college kids, I think, feel constricted by the teachings of our church, right? Maybe we want to talk about why worship is important, especially to a college kid. So to think in your mind and maybe even write down, journal out some themes or ideas that are important to you, but don't go and just force those themes to your OCF. Instead, get those on paper for yourself, step one. Then go to your OCF and ask them what they want to talk about. And as you're asking them what they want to talk about and getting topics, there'll be some hot button ones, some funny ones. Think about how you can implement those goals you have naturally into those topics, right? And so this will kind of help us do both things, keep them engaged, but also make sure that we're orchestrating this semester, quarter, year in a way that we also think is fruitful, because we are the leader and they're looking to us for meat. They want things that have meaning and are true. So I think it's really important to ask them what they want to hear and to be prepared for ourselves to speak about these things. It's super important as we're picking the right topics to be in the know of the modern conversation around these topics, right? If you haven't heard of the Skim or BuzzFeed or some other popular news websites, you got to know them, and at least know what these kids are probably reading online, what they're learning about and how they're getting their information, so that you can help frame what we know to be the truth, right? We don't have to be fearful about the teachings of our church because we actually believe it's the truth. But what we have to do is think about how we're presenting that to the college student. That's what's really critical. And then finally, when this same bucket of identifying, selecting the right topics at the right time, you can't dive into really hot button issues in your first meeting, right? It wouldn't be wise to try to talk about LGBTQ issues in your first OCF meeting, probably, because you have a group of people who aren't quite comfortable with each other yet, right? But you can and you should talk about those things a little later down the line. However, you'll never get a group that's comfortable talking about those things if you don't kind of, what I like to say, name drop those topics when it makes sense to. Don't just be like, oh, LGBTQ issues. But maybe if you're talking about church and society, for example, as a topic, you can be like, like a common day issue today is LGBTQ issues. And then the student's going to think, okay, maybe I have a question about that. Wasn't sure if I could ask the priest about this, but he mentioned it. So maybe next time I'm going to ask him this burning question I have about a little more of a hot button issue, let's say. Okay. And so these are probably the 3 most important things around asking effective questions. What do they want to know? What do we know? Can we present on it? And are we doing it at the right time throughout the course of knowing each other?
We can open it up for questions on this section.
You got some questions typed in while you were speaking. So first, specifically on topics from Father Anthony, is there a place to listen to YouTube videos and discuss it, to bring in technology, and how would you do that?
Yeah, I think absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think we are going to cover this a little bit at another point too, but while so much of discussion facilitation is asking questions and allowing kids to talk, there is space for little bits of content to be shared. So whether that's via a quote that you want them to chew on or a YouTube video that you want them to reflect on, it is very effective to not just pose a topic, but to give them something more tangible and meaty to chew on and to pick apart or to talk about as a group. So we're very big fans of using anything like that, especially YouTube videos. We use that to start discussions a lot.
We'll get into it more, but for myself, I actually set a rule for myself to at least use 2 type of interactive ways to help convey a topic, right? So that could be a video, it could be an activity, it could be a lot of different things. I mean, people are creative, you'll come up with more ideas than we will. But I would say there's not a place for it, there's a requirement for it.
Yeah.
That's great. And just to give a small plug, OCF does provide some of these resources. While we don't have an extensive YouTube channel, we do have our apologetics podcast with Father Brendan Pelfrey, which is students asking questions about how to understand and share their faith in short little snippets, usually 15 minutes long, something like that. And then we have lots and lots of blog posts, which I have used and I hope others have used to start chapter discussions. Again, either answering student questions or written by students themselves, reflecting on the spiritual life, and even just reading it can be a great place to, get the conversation going if it's appropriate to the topics that you want to approach. Okay, another great question on the last topic was says, I understand the need for a safe space, but we have a beautiful Christian language to express the concept in. What about fertile ground as an alternative?
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, that's good.
I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
I choose safe space because that's the buzzword of today, but
Yeah.
I think fertile ground is a very beautiful way of articulating exactly what we were trying to articulate. So thank you. I don't know who you are, but I may steal that and use that as I talk about this more. That really illustrates exactly what we're trying to facilitate.
We'll have to quote it, quoted by anonymous attendee,
And then finally, this question is, I think, going to apply more generally. So you let me know if you want to take it now or if you'd like to talk about it later. From Father Constantine, how do you facilitate safe, authentic discussion when you're fatigued? In other words, when you can't bring the energy or even the quality of content that you would like to do it, how do you still make it happen?
That's a great question. And hi, Father Constantine. I hope you're doing well. I hope your ministry is fruitful. I know it's fruitful. I honestly, this has happened to me a lot. I'm sure for both of us. I tell the kids straight up, if I'm tired, I will walk into that meeting and be like, you guys, I'm so tired right now. And they bring the energy. It's really cool. So if I'm prepared, try to be prepared. If I don't have the energy, I tell them and they lift me up, right? Because, that's how it works. But if I try to fake it, they're going to know. And it's going to, I've noticed for me, it drags everything down a little more, as opposed to saying, hey, you guys, I had this long day. I tell them why I'm fatigued, at least in an appropriate way. I won't, give out private information or something, but tell them, it was this long day, this and that happened. And the next thing you know, you kind of turn lemons into lemonade in that sense.
Yeah. Great. And the beautiful thing about facilitation is that sometimes just having a list of great questions. So I'll prepare a list ahead of time, because sometimes when you're exhausted, it's hard to come up with good questions in the moment. and just having kind of like a backup list of good questions to ask. The discussion often does take on a life of its own, and that's the beautiful thing, is that sometimes it doesn't require as much energy as we think it will. Maybe being fatigued may allow them to take on more of the life, and that's what is supposed to happen anyway. And so sometimes it's for our own benefit that we may be fatigued in leading a discussion.
And I will just add too that I think that the model that Father Kosmas and Anna are giving us is something that, especially clergy, who I know there's not a single one of you that isn't overworked and fatigued at all times. This is something that you could train other people in your parish, lay people, to do for your young people, for your college students. Because I mean, Father Kosmas said, you know, even when you're selecting a topic, you choose something that's the right time, the right topic that they want to hear, and also that you're prepared. So it doesn't mean that you have to have someone who knows every answer to every question that could possibly come out there, just someone that is willing to create this space, to create a non-judgmental tone, put a little bit of time in to do a little research or ask the right questions. So I would encourage you, if you're feeling like OCF is just another box that you are too exhausted to check off, and I know that it feels that way for a lot of clergy sometimes, that you really consider involving some lay people in this part of the ministry anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so are we good to move on? Great. The next role that you have as a facilitator is in asking effective questioning. So this gets a little bit more, we're going to unpack one of the previous questions we had. So, you know, the saying, there's no such thing as a bad question. Well, as a facilitator, there is such thing as a bad question. So there is such thing as effective and non-effective questioning for you as the leader, as the facilitator. So we would say, as my husband was sharing earlier, an ineffective question or a bad question would be a closed-ended question. I don't know if you've heard, many of you have probably heard of the concept of opened and closed-ended questions, but like we said earlier, a closed-ended question prompts a yes or no answer. So what do you think about this? Or do you agree with this? Would be an example of a closed question. Do you agree with the church's stance on abortion? Yes? No? Okay, well, that kind of stops the conversation right there. Instead of, what do you think about the church's stance on abortion? Or what do you know about the church's stance on X, Y, and Z? Or asking questions that really open up the conversation versus close it off. And so it does take it's taken me a long time to not even perfect, because I definitely haven't perfected it, but to get comfortable with effective questioning. I've spent a lot of time really intentionally thinking through how to ask questions and reading up on good questioning techniques. It's hard to get really comfortable asking effective questions. So don't get frustrated, first of all, when they don't roll off very easily, or when you find yourself asking closed-ended questions accidentally. But think through. That's why I find it so valuable to think through ahead of time the kinds of questions I'm going to ask about a certain topic. And this goes into preparation. So you may not think preparation is super important when facilitating a discussion, but I have found that really thinking through the topic we're going to discuss, and actually kind of thinking through a line of questioning. So if the topic is abortion, thinking through where do we want to go? Where do I need to start? And what's the kind of line of questioning that's going to help the kids really unpack the issue and to really understand this topic? Or fasting. What do we want them to come out knowing and understanding and being challenged about? What concepts do I want them to be challenged about? And so really thinking through what the goals are and the objectives are of discussing a certain topic, and then thinking through what the appropriate line of questioning would be to really facilitate them being challenged and really thinking through and understanding a topic. And really thinking through what is the heart of what you want to discuss. So if you want to have a conversation on racism, what is it that you're really thinking to accomplish? Do you want them to walk away with an awareness of the issue? Do you want them to have a change of heart on the issue? Are you trying for this group to be moved to action? So having an idea, again, of that purpose and the goals of what's kind of the purpose of the discussion will help you in informing the effective questions for the conversation. And then I would say, don't be afraid to bring feelings into the conversation. So don't be afraid to ask what you feel. So we often say, what do you think about this? But asking what you feel about something, or opening up the conversation for students to share not just their thoughts, but also how they are feeling about a certain topic, can promote healthy conversation. Especially, but you do want to make sure that you've properly facilitated a fertile ground for that space for people to be able to share their feelings. We don't just want to invite everyone to share their feelings in a space that may not be fertile and affirming of all those feelings. And then a little tip, so as you encourage people to share a little bit more, so if someone shares an opinion, asking furthering questions about it, so tell me more about that, or furthering their thoughts on that can help move the conversation along. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but I learned this in our listening class at school, at seminary. I always ask why do you think that, or why? And I was very lovingly corrected that sometimes that can come off very accusatory. If you are constantly asking, well, why do you think that? It can come off as like, oh, am I not supposed to think that? Or, it can be a little bit, even if you're not saying it in an abrasive way, sometimes the why questioning can come off a little bit accusatory. And so that's something that's like a good example of, it's taken me a long time to get that type of questioning out of my system, but just being intentional and thinking through the way you're asking questions, the tone with which you're asking questions, that we don't want to be leading them per se to a particular answer. So asking, while you may have a clear train of questioning, it's important to question in a way where your students know they don't think they're being led to answer the question in a certain way. That it's a question that really is asking for their true and honest opinion, not for the Sunday school answer, or the answer they think that they should say. And then make sure your questioning and in leading the conversation, that you're making it very relatable to their everyday life. So if it's a theoretical, not staying in theory land, so asking questions that really bring the topic into their everyday lives and apply it to their everyday lives. So that's a little bit of a tip on, as you're thinking through the line of questioning, making sure you're not staying in the theory and the philosophical level, but bringing it into, well, how does this impact my life? How do I come into contact with this topic in my life? Thinking through, how do your students come into contact with this topic, and asking questions that help them wrestle with that. That's a little bit about effective questioning. We would love to take any questions on that.
Yes. I will just add 2 lines of questioning that I've heard that also shut down conversation. One is that, how many of you, insert whatever the second half of the question is. I hear it a lot. It's surprising, actually, because really the answer is a raise of hands maybe, but it doesn't really go beyond that. So how many of you is not a great way of starting questions. And then the other one, I think Anna was alluding to this a little bit, is those questions where there is an answer, like, I don't know, what feast day is X or something like that. It might be like part of the conversation somewhere in there, but it's definitely not going to move the discussion along if you're really trying to get a room talking. So just something to think about. I think often we rely on that, and we're like, well, we're asking questions, why isn't anyone responding? But those questions aren't really opening anything up. And then I was hoping, before I do have a question for you, but I also was hoping you could comment on how you use the silent space after a question, or if you also sometimes use note cards or journaling to help get the conversation going, or if you could comment on how, I know you use those tools, so I'm kind of outing you on how those help you with, letting there be space between the question and the answer.
Yep. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the journal. So I would, and I do it with high school. I primarily minister to high school students. So getting high schoolers to journal, trust me, it's not an easy task, but it's super effective. And if it's effective for high school students, it's even more effective for college students. So I would even advise that maybe your group, they have journals or they always have paper with them. So sometimes I will ask the opening question or a really good question. I'll have the kids journal on it for a few moments before we open it up for discussion for a few reasons. One, being not all kids verbally process. A lot of kids, a lot of people need that space need some space to gather their thoughts and to process their thoughts about a topic or a question. And so it can be, for someone who really processes that way, it's very daunting and really ineffective to throw out a question, and then everyone who feels very confident and is a verbal processor, they'll all jump in and share their thoughts before the other students have even had a chance to collect and gather their thoughts on a certain topic. So it really helps even those people who are verbal processors and those who will be a little bit more hesitant to actually writing, just giving that space, even if you don't have to force them to write, but even giving that 30 seconds of silence before jumping in and discussing a question gives everyone, and it evens the playing field, and it gives everyone a chance to really think through what their response is before just jumping in. So I'm a big fan of the journal. Utilize that a lot, and then you'll find actually that in a situation where you ask a question and there's a lot of silence, whenever if you do that and you didn't ask them to journal, have them journal. If there's absolutely silence, no one has anything to say, have them journal their thoughts and then ask again for sharing. And there will be someone. I've never had someone not have something to say.
And in that vein of silence also, as the facilitator, be okay with the silence. Especially if you're facilitating a conversation, the silence is probably half as uncomfortable as you feel it is. Right? Like, people are okay for a moment to just sit and think for a second. And so you can let the silence rest for probably twice as long as you think you can, right? If it's like, if it feels like 10 minutes and it's been like 30 seconds, it's like, let it sit there for a minute and see what happens as well.
Yeah, and that's really important. And that's where we as leaders have to get comfortable. Whenever I think our fear of silence is an indication of our own insecurities. And like, I know, at least for myself, what goes through my head when there's uncomfortable silence, it's this is a terrible discussion. I'm doing a horrible job facilitating this. No one's talking. No one has things to say. This is all my fault. I did a really bad job. And so we jump in to insert our own thoughts and opinions about something, when really all we needed is 30 seconds of letting people think and mull and sit in that uncomfortable silence, and then be ready to come forward with their thoughts. So and I'm guilty of it. It's an indication, I think, sometimes of our own insecurity to want to jump in and break the silence, but just be peaceful in those moments and let them sit and simmer.
So Father Anthony asked, do you have a list of good questions?
Yes. So I think in my handout that we're going to give, yes. So we made a handout of some great ways, some good questions. So you will be getting at the end of this a list of questions, a list of great ways to start conversation starters and questions. And in general, my go-to is tell me more about that. So I've given you will have a list of like good starters. And if someone says something, it's really great way to like keep the conversation going, because typically someone will say a sentence and there's really a lot more behind what their one statement is. And so my go-to is tell me a little bit more about that, to open it up a little bit, open the conversation up a little bit more. But you will get a good list of questions that will be helpful in facilitating conversation.
All right. So now we're going to go into let's actually get into the discussion, right? Like, as a moderator, what are just some things to think about when we have an OCF meeting in like 15 minutes. what do we do? No, I'm just kidding. But how do we actually prepare for the discussion and moderate it? And the first thing is just that we have to prepare. Like I think we mentioned earlier, you can try to walk into one and you might get lucky. Maybe it'll be a great conversation. Maybe it won't. But it's really important to prepare for a topic. Once you've maybe collected a list of topics that your college kids want to talk about, what's nice about that, by the way, is you might be able to organize them in a way, find overlapping concepts and things like that, and kind of see what makes the most sense as to what topics you should talk about throughout the year. But once you're going into that specific topic, be prepared to talk about that specific topic. You're not going to be writing necessarily like a step-by-step lesson plan, right? Introduction, 7 minutes, we're doing this. And then transition period, 3 minutes, we're doing that, right? Not necessarily that. I don't think you need that level of detail for a college level discussion. But what you do need to have, and this goes back to what we talked about earlier, to be prepared and having looked through what's on the internet, what's available to you, and everything from the modern day internet to the fathers and to the scriptures itself, which would be any quotes, articles, videos, activities that would be pertinent to that topic. What activity might be out there for you to get this concept kicking in someone's head? What quotes might you want to have in your back pocket in case these topics come up? And those classic books, Thoughts Determine Our Lives, or Wounded by Love. You can look in these books and literally you can look in the index. If you don't have a ton of time, go to the index and look at the topic you're talking about and look at the quotes and see. You'll find a couple quotes. You'll be like, oh, I bet you that'd be a good one to have. This would be a good one to have. Mark them up. Bring the books with you. You look kind of official because you have the book with you, Even if you didn't read it, they won't know. I'm just kidding. Hopefully you've read it. But bring those things with you. Bring the book so they see the book and, you read from the book a quote that's connected and like, okay, it will spark the college student to say, ooh, I can dig deeper on this thing we're talking about here. So be prepared, and not just be prepared, be over prepared. Have more references and touch points than you think you necessarily need, because you're going to use some, you're going to not use some, you're going to use some you didn't think you would need to use. And so it's really, really important to think of it that way. Okay. And so I really encourage that.
So while teaching content isn't the main objective of facilitating a discussion, it is really helpful to have pieces of content to use as the backbone of the discussion and to give the kids something to pick apart and to help them to think more deeply or more further about a certain topic.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. When topics come up that might have more than one side to them, let's say within Orthodoxy even, it's really important. So this is the next point. If something comes up that, for example, a simple one might be like, how frequently should I go to confession? Well, we know different traditions within Orthodoxy have different ways they practice that reality, right? And so I think it's really important, especially when we're OCF, we have to be mindful, we're probably with a pan-Orthodox crowd. It's really important to present what might be normal in different jurisdictions of Orthodoxy as opposed to what you think is best or what your tradition does, right? It's really important to allow them to realize that, Orthodox, even within its jurisdictions, isn't one hard and fast thing, but we have those small key traditions. So it's really important, and that's even more important for maybe things that are a little more conflicting, let's say, within Orthodoxy, to present both sides in an honest manner, not to overimpose our own opinion about that specific topic, if that makes sense.
That means you have to be prepared by doing the research. You have to know what all the different, you have to do research in the sense of being aware of the different perspectives and the different traditions and such.
And then, so that's a little bit about preparation, but when we're moderating the discussion, a few pointers, a few pieces of advice that we might have. Number one, don't jump to answers right away. This isn't whack-a-mole, right? We're not like question, bam, got that one, and as the moderator, we're just popping down every answer. As opposed to that, we're trying to really facilitate. An ideal would be to help guide the participants to arrive at the answer as a group. That's the ideal. That doesn't always happen, but think of it that way. You're an orchestra conductor. We're trying to unpack concepts as opposed to have stagnant Q&A sessions. When questions come up, even if it's a question that might be difficult for you to answer, it's really great to reflect a question back. So it gives yourself time to think about it if you're not ready on your toes to answer the question, but also lets you get a little more information about what's in the mind of the person questioning. So if a question comes up, it's really oftentimes a great technique to say, well, what do you think about that question? And if that person doesn't say anything, let me open it up to the group. Does anyone have any thoughts or ideas about this question? And sometimes you'll get some answers. Usually you will get some feedback on it. It's great to ask follow-up questions, right? And that can really manifest itself in a lot of ways. As we said, feel free to say, tell me more about that. Again, that'll also give you more time to think about something if you need to yourself. Another really important thing when we're moderating, it's super important to draw in those by name. We said earlier at the beginning, it's really important to know people's names. I think it's super important to at least have given every single person the opportunity to speak, and that's the job of the moderator. If there are people who haven't been speaking and you're past like the halfway point of your time, it's important to say, well, John, what do you think about that? Or John, do you have anything to add to this? If not, oh, that's okay. There's no pressure, but make sure everyone has a chance to say something. And that means if someone hasn't said something, it's up to the moderator to address that for sure. And without pressure. We talked about silence, to be comfortable with that. It's really important to be mindful of people dominating the conversation. We can't have that. It's not good for a conversation. So if you notice that someone is an over talker, not that it's a bad thing. It's great to really want to talk about something, but it's important. If the conversation is getting stuck on an issue, we need to park it. So we would ask someone who's really wanting to talk about a specific issue, you know what, hey, Eleni, can we park that? I want to talk to you more about that. We want to validate the desire. I want to talk to you more about that, but can we park it so that we can stay on track with a few more things we want to touch on tonight? And then make sure you unpark it, put it back in drive. After that evening or at another point, go to that person maybe one-on-one as people are exiting and say, and talk more deeply about something that might kind of be derailing the conversation. That's really, really important because you'll just lose the rest of the group if one person is over talking and kind of oversharing about a specific issue. So we got to keep the group on track. That's our goal, right, as the conductor. We will have difficult personalities, which is okay. We're all difficult personalities at one point or another. So it's not like those people who are difficult. We're all difficult. But when we're in that time, we want to remember that this is a captive audience for a short amount of time. It's a busy college student. So we want to take care of the over talkers. If someone's shy, I just mentioned, let's address them by name and open a door for them to talk. And then if anything gets aggressive or conflicting, we'll address that, and I'll address that now. Or if we have any questions first.
So any questions on the general moderation?
I think let's go ahead and do the last section and take questions at the end just to be mindful of our time.
Perfect. Great. So then one of the more difficult personalities can be the aggressive personality and just managing conflict in general. So when you're having these conversations with college age students, it's naturally conflict's going to arise. There are a lot of different opinions. There's a lot of different, especially at this age, people feel very strongly about their opinions and about certain topics. So especially if you're hitting on some of the more hot button issues, there's bound to be a little bit of conflict in these discussions. And so what is the best way to manage that conflict? It's important to think about, I think it can be very tempting to agree to disagree. And while that sounds like maybe a nice way to manage the conflict, I think that actually shuts down a really important opportunity. When conflict arises, you have the opportunity to lead the group into a deeper understanding of each other. And you have the opportunity to affirm each person in that room. And so knowing that we've set the ground rule for respect so that whatever is articulated, even if it's disagreement, it's being articulated in a respectful way, encouraging the students to, okay, you don't agree with that. Let's hear a little bit more about where this person is coming from and how that is informed, how they're, why this is such an important thing for them or why this stance is so important for them. And so you will do that by moderating and by shutting down the kind of disrespectful thing. So for example, I did a lesson on gender in my Sunday school class, and we had two students who are friends with each other, but who had very, very different opinions. And it became a little bit heated where they were kind of going at each other. And so as the moderator, I had to say, okay, all right, Julia, I love what you're thinking about that. That is really important. I want to hear a little bit about where Georgia's coming from with this. Georgia, why do you feel, not why, see, I go with the why. Tell me a little bit more about what you're thinking about this, or where this thought is coming from. Tell me a little bit more about that. And kind of moderating, you may have to actually like calm two people down in a situation and lead them to a deeper interest in the other person's opinion. And you do that by actually you yourself being interested and curious into knowing a person's stance on an issue. And so modeling that really within conflict, the goal of the discussion is not to come to a consensus. We want to come to a deeper understanding of one another. We want to form connections with each other. And so in doing that, in really modeling that care and true authentic interest in where the other person is coming from. And so truly you yourself have to truly yourself care. It can be easy, we all have our biases and we all get triggered by certain things. So it's really important to try to temper that within ourselves and then to model that for the students, and setting that as a ground rule that we just care about coming to a deeper understanding of one another and knowing that we all have different thoughts and feelings and opinions on different topics and conversations. So ultimately the goal is to seek connection and understanding, not agreement, which is important.
This is where the ground rules part of this is so important, right? Because if we have a ground rule that we respect each other, that we listen to each other, listening to hear, not listening to respond to or retort at, then we can, as a facilitator, if it's getting a little bit out of hand, we just point back to these ground rules, whether they're written on the wall or just agreed upon, and say, okay, because typically these opinions are shaped by real and true experiences, feelings, relationships in that person's life. And so that really can be an opportunity to grow their two people's relationship, even if they don't see something the same way.
Those are what we would see as kind of the 5 main roles that you as a facilitator would have in moderating a discussion for OCF for your college age students. So at this point, we'll take any final questions on any of that.
Just to repeat them real quick, we went over creating the space, physical and not physical, identifying, selecting the right topics, asking effective questions, we'll give you a list of some, moderating the discussion, and managing conflict.
Does anyone have any questions? I will ask one. How, when you're managing conflict, when you have two people on two sides of an issue, and maybe from where you're sitting at the table, one person has a perspective that's closer to the church's teaching and another doesn't, how do you really make sure you both make space for them both to be heard and affirmed while still affirming the church's teaching for the rest of your group or the rest of your class?
Yeah, that's the clincher right there. That's the tricky part right there, is because obviously there are the church we have a broad perspective on a lot of things, but we do have some very clear truths. And so at the end of the day, you don't want the students walking away thinking that this one person's opinion is the truth is what the church teaches is truth. And so that's where you really affirm this person's opinion. This situation I brought up, this girl who she has a lot of maybe more liberal ideas than our church would be totally on board with, but she knows that I really respect her and I respect what she had, her feelings and her thoughts on these issues, and you make that very clear and you give her the space to talk and you make it a conversation, and then you say, and I do want to share with you, this is what the church would teach about this, and this is why the church. It's really important to unpack the why, and that's where you really have to do your research, because there's always a really good reason why our church has certain stance. Like our church may have some people may think are some harsh or not fair stances, but there's really, really good sound rationale behind what our church teaches. And so you got to get clear on that before going into this discussion, especially if you're talking about a hot button topic. So if you're talking about abortion, if you're talking about LGBTQ, you need to know the whys so that you can then articulate the whys to the students. You don't just want to articulate what, but you want to articulate why. And you're just sharing that. Maybe at the end, I need to share with you, this is a little bit about why the church has this stance. And then you're posing it to them, you're offering it to them. They can take it, they can leave it. But it is, of course, thank you for adding that little bit. It's really important that you do articulate what the church's position is and why. I think the why piece is really important.
And I think for just one thing to add, I think for a college student, it's important to understand that oftentimes refer to these as the church's stance, which is fine, but it's important to make it clear that the church's stance isn't a stance about you because you might think something. And so all of a sudden the church, if I don't agree with that stance, all of a sudden the church took a stance against me, right? It's really good to kind of say these stances, as we call them, are really guidelines, right? There's something that help keep us on the path. And if we don't, the church is going to try to reroute us. But why this thing that might be our stance is really an indicator that we're not on the path, which is okay. It's okay to not be on the path, but this is how we get back onto the path. And so it's also important to make it very clear that it's not personal, a certain truth of the church, a certain teaching of the church. It's not personal to you, and that means that you're against the church, or the church is against you. The church isn't against people. The church it's a hospital, right? So anyway.
Great. We have a couple of questions.
Great.
Nick asks, when is it appropriate to discuss applying church truths in everyday life during these conversations?
Yeah. So we always want to bring the application piece into the conversation. And so that is where you as the facilitator need to determine when the best place is. So it may be appropriate to facilitate some conversation on what the church truths are or why we believe in them. And then you'll move the conversation into, okay, so why does this even matter for our lives? In what ways do you come into contact with this in your everyday life? Or in what ways do you think this has some impact on you as college students? And so asking questions like that really focus on, all right, so we've spent, a half an hour talking about this issue. Well, let's talk about now, why is this important for our lives, and in what ways do we come into contact with this issue or with in this? I would say it needs to be a ground rule or a rule for you as a facilitator that every discussion you facilitate needs to have an application component to it. So you need to be asking a question, and that's where thinking through your line of questioning ahead of time will help you know, okay, I want to start here with the theory, but I want to end here with the application. And so once I know that they've discussed this part well enough, then I'm going to bring in these questions that will help them apply it.
I'm a big fan of some variation of the question, what's one small thing you could do tomorrow related to X, whatever we're talking about. If you're talking about prayer or fasting, what's one small thing you could do or you could change in your life right now too, so that there's some kind of immediate impact in their life, that it doesn't, because sometimes even those questions can, if you ask like, well, how does this relate to your everyday life, it can end up being very theoretical or end up being about everybody else and not about me. So I like asking I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. It's a question I found to be helpful. Father Anthony asks, how do you handle it personally if after all the prep, it still goes flat? Has that happened to you, and what did you do?
Oh yeah. Not all the time. Every single time happens. No, I'm just kidding. First, Father Anthony, I confessed to myself in my mind, this is so annoying. Like I'm frustrated, right? So I guess I am honest with myself that I let myself be annoyed, and then I let that annoyance leave, right? So because typically you're going to realize that all the preparation has fallen flat when you're in the middle of a conversation. That's not really a conversation, right? And so I think the first thing is to identify it and say, okay, I'm noticing that this conversation is not going how I thought it would. And I'm frustrated by that. Okay, now I'm going to think about what's the best I can do to make the most out of this time. These kids are here now, and I have them now. And so this is where having that cachet of resources like videos, quotes, etc., are for sure going to help you out. If you play a video, well, first of all, it's going to take 5 to 7 minutes anyway just to play it, but there will be conversation around videos. There always are, that are pertinent to the conversation. So I would move past the things that seem like they're not gaining traction. After having tried silence, tried journaling around silence, I would just slowly move on down the line. And the more of a bucket of resources I have to dip into in my preparation, the more that I'm going to have something to get the conversation started.
And you're at least you're at least then offering them something. So maybe this group, maybe you got the wrong combination of people, maybe they're exhausted, maybe they just really don't want to talk, but at least you're offering them, you have some content or things to give them to think through. At least you have something to offer them so that they're getting some value out of this evening.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just, if it really, if you've tried all of these things and the conversation really isn't going anywhere, maybe either the kids that showed up that night really weren't interested in this topic. It was a whole different group of people that wanted to talk about this topic and they're just not really interested. And so maybe you turn it around and you're going to say, all right, let's just get to know each other. Or let's build, let's use this night for a different purpose. Let's hang out. Tell what's going on in your life. Let's just catch up. We don't have to, it's okay to move on from a specific topic you thought you would be discussing and just use that time to build relationships with the students in the room.
Yeah. And I would add one more thing, which is that if you're noticing that it's you're continually struggling, like maybe you tried one and then another time this happened, try asking young people who are at your disposal, not in the OCF, what they think about something that you are in the process of preparing. Maybe you have some college students or young adults at your parish. You can ask them, what do you think about this? Bounce these ideas off of other people who are in a similar demographic who might be interested, and they will help give you feedback on what kids want to talk about or how you could reshape or reconfigure a conversation.
And I'd say this is a place where consistency with meeting really matters, because to be able to have young people who feel comfortable with you and with each other enough that they will have these kind of conversations, you need to be meeting every week. If you're only meeting once a month, it's going to be I feel like it's a little bit of a gamble every time then, because the group will be different every time. You won't know them basically every time. You'll be having to spend time just getting to know them. So this is where really consistently meeting, and even if you're not having this kind of depth of conversation every week at your meeting, maybe you only do this once or twice a month, and the other week nights you just meet them for dinner, or they just get together for dinner even if you can't attend. That really will help, I think. And then it won't matter too much also if you have one night that feels like a flop, because it's not the only chance you had to speak to those college students in the next month. I want to be mindful of the fact that it is a little bit after our time, but we do have one more question. And then I think we'll go ahead and let this be the last question. I really appreciate that you guys really got the conversation going. I think that's a testament to your skill on this topic. Trey asks, what methods lead these questions to make Christ himself and his person or his personality real to the students so that they can see him more clearly and be inspired by him? So I guess so that we don't walk away just having had a good debate, but really coming to know our Lord.
I think the first thing that kind of came to my mind with that question is that it's your job to be Christ, to model Christ in these discussions. So in the way that you're moderating all the things that we articulated, that's how Christ moderated discussions. That's how Christ interacted with people. He never, even with the woman at the well, he didn't judge her. Like if you read that passage, he articulated some truths, but he did so in a non-judgmental way. He did so in a way that was, he asked her to give her water first, which is something a man would have never asked a woman in that time period. He respected her person and who she was. And so in all the ways that we've outlined how to moderate a discussion and how to create that fertile ground, we really just took how Christ interacts with everyone, with human beings, and and we're articulating that for us. So really you're demonstrating and being Christ's presence for these kids. And that's why it's really important to be respectful, to be non-judgmental, to affirm, to love, to get to know each person, to really build those relationships, because ultimately you're modeling Christ's love for them in that situation.
Yeah. Another good example of that was this past Sunday's gospel reading, right? When the man asks him how to inherit eternal life, and Christ says, well, what is the law? How do you read it? He reflected the question back on him, and then he used a story, right? When talking about the Good Samaritan. But I think a thing to think about is that there is no method, because we're not Christ. We are trying to be channels of Christ, right? And so I can't really add much more to what Anna said, which is what we are doing is trying to reflect his love and mercy on these students by just trying to be a channel of him and an image of him. That's it. He will do the rest. And God willing, we are the best channel or conduit of him that we can be.
And it's important to enter these conversations prayerfully. I always try to just say a few words of prayer in my head before starting a discussion to remind myself that I'm just a vessel, and that really we want Christ's presence in these conversations. And so then to that point, I would open with a prayer. We want these conversations. What makes OCF discussions unique and special is not just that you're bringing in church father quotes or you're teaching them the tenets of our faith, but that we're infusing this whole experience with Christ's love, and in that opening and closing with prayer is a really good way to set the tone for the discussion and center the discussion well.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate everything you've shared with us. I just want to let everyone who's still on the call know that we do have 2 more training webinars planned for this season, one in January and one in February. If you don't feel prepared to talk about some of these difficult topics, Dr. Philip Mamalakis is going to be doing a training webinar specifically on how to discuss sexuality with college students. So come prepared with your questions for that one. And then our February webinar will be with Father Patrick Tischel and Christy Buck, who's a mental health specialist, talking about how we can better address, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, student mental health, which I think we are all very concerned about right now. I just also want to let everyone know that, as always, you can look at the information for those webinars at ocf.net/training-webinars. I will also be sending you lots of emails, as I like to do. But the registration is open for both of those at this time. Also, I just want to ask all of you that you continue to support OCF in all the ways that you already do through your love and your service to others, but try to remember us on Giving Tuesday. We will be having a Giving Tuesday campaign and your financial gifts support this ministry so that we can have more people like Father Kosmas and Anna come and give training webinars for you, more events for your students, retreats and resources for you on campus. So please remember us at that time. As always, I will be available to you, as is Father Miles. If you have any follow-up questions from this webinar or any questions about OCF in general, my email is just christina@ocf.net. You can be expecting to hear from me this week, because I will send the lovely handout that Father Kosmas and Anna made for you. And I think with that, Father Miles, do you mind closing us in prayer?
Sorry there. Couldn't get the unmute button to work. Thank you very much. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, amen. The Lord, we thank you for the blessings of this day and this evening, instilling wisdom and knowledge in our minds and our hearts, and also the zeal to do your work and to follow in your footsteps, and helping to lead others, especially our college students, our young people, to love for you, to follow you, and to know how your word instills peace and goodness in life. We ask this, your blessing upon all those participating this evening, and continue to watch us in your care. The Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and Christ is always among us.
He is and always shall be. Thank you all so much for attending this evening, and have a lovely night.
Good night.
Good night.